Karoline Leavitt walked into the courtroom that morning like any other person might, calm, composed, and unassuming. She was dressed neatly in a modest blouse and skirt, her dark hair pulled back into a simple ponytail. Around her neck hung a small gold cross, delicate and understated, something she had worn every day since she was a teenager. To Karoline, it wasn't just jewelry, it was a piece of who she was, a quiet reminder of her faith and values. But little did she know, this tiny accessory would soon become the center of attention in a way she never expected. The room buzzed with low murmurs as people settled into their seats. Lawyers shuffled papers, witnesses waited nervously, and the bailiff called for silence when Judge Harold Grayson entered. Known throughout the legal community for his stern demeanor and rigid interpretation of rules, Judge Grayson commanded respect, or at least fear, from everyone who appeared before him. His sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail, missing nothing, and then they landed on Karoline. At first glance, there was nothing particularly remarkable about her. She sat quietly at the defendant's table, hands folded in her lap, looking like someone who simply wanted to get through the day. But Judge Grayson's gaze lingered on the gleaming cross around her neck. He frowned, leaning forward slightly, in his high-backed chair. "Ms. Leavitt," he said abruptly, his voice cutting through the hum of activity like a knife. "Is that a religious symbol you're wearing?" Karoline blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied softly, her fingers instinctively brushing against the pendant. "It's a cross." Judge Grayson's frown deepened. "This is a court of law," he declared, his tone firm and authoritative. "Not a place for personal expressions of belief. I must insist that you remove it immediately." A ripple of surprise moved through the gallery. Some attendees exchanged glances, others leaned forward, curious to see how Karoline would respond. For her part, Karoline didn't flinch. Instead, she met the judge's gaze steadily, though her voice remained soft and respectful. "Your Honor, if I may, this cross is not intended as a statement or distraction. It's something I've worn my entire life. It's part of who I am." But Judge Grayson wasn't swayed. If anything, her explanation seemed to irritate him. Further, "Part of who you are?" he echoed, his voice rising slightly. "We're here to determine facts and administer justice, Ms. Leavitt, not to accommodate personal preferences. Remove the cross or face a fine for contempt of court." For a moment, the room fell completely silent. All eyes were on Karoline now, waiting to see what she would do next. Would she argue? Protest? Refuse? Instead, she did none of those things. With a slow nod, she reached up and unclasped the chain, slipping the cross off her neck and placing it gently into her purse. The action was simple, almost mundane, but it carried an undeniable weight. No one spoke as she returned her hands to her lap, her expression unreadable. Satisfied that he had asserted his authority, Judge Grayson turned his attention back to the case at hand. But even as the proceedings continued, something about Karoline lingered in the air. A quiet intensity, a sense that there was more to her than met the eye. Those watching couldn't quite put their finger on it, but they found themselves drawn to her calm presence, her unwavering composure in the face of such public scrutiny. As the hearing progressed, Judge Grayson announced his decision regarding the matter of the cross. "Ms. Leavitt, your refusal to comply with my directive demonstrates a lack of respect for this court. Therefore, I am fining you $200 for contempt." The words hung heavily in the room, met with stunned silence. Even the stenographer paused mid-typing, her brow furrowing in disbelief. Karoline didn't protest. She didn't raise her voice or demand an explanation. Instead, she simply nodded again, pulling out a small leather-bound journal from her bag and jotting down a few notes. Her pen moved swiftly across the page, capturing details with precision and care. To anyone watching, it seemed like an odd reaction. Why take notes over a relatively minor fine? Yet there was something deliberate, almost calculated, about the way she wrote. It was as if she were documenting not just the events of the day, but also preparing for something far greater. The audience began to whisper among themselves. Who was this woman, really? Why hadn't she fought back against the judge's ruling? Was she planning some kind of appeal? Speculation ran rampant, but no answers were forthcoming. Karoline remained silent, her focus entirely on the task at hand. She listened intently as the prosecution presented its case, occasionally flipping through her notebook or underlining key points. Every movement was purposeful, every gesture measured. What no one realized, not even Judge Grayson, was that beneath Karoline's calm exterior lay a mind sharper than most could imagine. Years of rigorous study, late nights poring over legal texts, and countless hours spent advocating for those without a voice had honed her skills to a razor's edge. This wasn't just a courtroom appearance for her. It was another opportunity to fight for justice, to prove that fairness mattered more than power or position. And so, as the day wore on, the tension in the room grew thicker. Judge Grayson, unaware of the storm brewing beneath Karoline's serene surface, pressed forward with the trial. Little did he know that this seemingly ordinary young woman was about to turn his courtroom, and perhaps even his world view, upside down. As the trial moved forward, it quickly became clear that Karoline Leavitt was not your average defendant. While many people might have been intimidated by the gravity of a courtroom or overwhelmed by the legal jargon flying back and forth, Karoline seemed entirely at ease. Her calm demeanor never wavered, even when the prosecution launched into its arguments with aggressive confidence. Each accusation, each piece of evidence presented against her, was met with a quiet but undeniable force, a force that slowly began to unravel the case the opposing side had worked so hard to build. The first sign that something was different came during the cross-examination of the prosecution's key witness. The lawyer, a seasoned professional known for his sharp tactics, attempted to trip Karoline up with complex questions designed to confuse her. But instead of stumbling, Karoline listened carefully, nodding occasionally as if she were simply having a casual conversation. When it was her turn to respond, she didn't hesitate. With clarity and precision, she dismantled the witness's testimony point by point, pointing out inconsistencies and contradictions that no one else in the room had noticed. "What you're saying here," Karoline said, gesturing to a document the witness had referenced earlier, "directly contradicts what's written in Exhibit B. Can you explain why that is?" Her tone was polite, almost conversational, but the question hit like a hammer. The witness fumbled for an answer, glancing nervously at the prosecutor for help. It was a small victory, but one that sent ripples through the courtroom. Spectators exchanged glances, some leaning forward in their seats, eager to see what Karoline would do next. But this was only the beginning. As the trial continued, Karoline's brilliance became impossible to ignore. Every time the prosecution tried to make a point, she countered with a well-reasoned argument backed by solid legal precedent. She quoted Supreme Court rulings, cited obscure statutes, and referenced cases from decades ago, all without ever breaking a sweat. Even the most experienced attorneys in the gallery found themselves whispering to each other, marveling at her depth of knowledge and ability to think on her feet. At one point, the prosecutor argued that certain evidence should be excluded because it lacked relevance to the charges. Karoline stood up, her posture relaxed but commanding, and calmly explained why the evidence was not only relevant but crucial to understanding the full context of the case. "Your Honor," she said, addressing Judge Grayson directly, "this evidence demonstrates a pattern of behavior that directly ties into the allegations being made. To exclude it would be to deny both the court and the jury the opportunity to see the bigger picture." Her words were measured, yet they carried an undeniable weight. Judge Grayson paused, clearly considering her argument. After a moment, he ruled in her favor, allowing the evidence to remain part of the trial. It was another win for Karoline, and the prosecutor looked visibly frustrated, scribbling notes furiously as he tried to regroup. What truly set Karoline apart, however, wasn't just her knowledge of the law. It was her ability to connect with people. Despite the formal setting of the courtroom, she spoke in a way that felt approachable and genuine. When questioning witnesses, she didn't attack or belittle them. Instead, she guided them gently toward revealing the truth. Her questions were framed in a way that encouraged honesty rather than defensiveness. This subtle skill won over not only the jury, but also several members of the audience, who found themselves rooting for her despite knowing little about the specifics of the case. Judge Grayson, too, couldn't help but notice the shift in the room's energy. At first, he had dismissed Karoline as someone who was merely lucky or playing a clever game. But as the hours passed, he began to realize that there was more to her than met the eye. Her arguments weren't just rehearsed lines. They were thoughtful, strategic, and deeply informed. And while he prided himself on maintaining control of his courtroom, he couldn't deny that Karoline was starting to take charge in ways he hadn't anticipated. One particularly memorable moment came during a heated exchange between Karoline and the prosecutor. The latter accused her of misinterpreting a statute, claiming that her interpretation was far-fetched and unsupported by case law. Without missing a beat, Karoline pulled out a copy of a landmark decision from 1973, flipping to the exact page and paragraph that supported her claim. "If you'll refer to Section 4, Paragraph C," she said, holding up the document for everyone to see, "you'll find that my interpretation aligns perfectly with the ruling in Smith v. State. Perhaps you'd like to review it?" The prosecutor's face turned red, and the audience couldn't suppress a few muffled chuckles. Even Judge Grayson allowed himself a brief smirk before quickly composing his expression. From that point on, the prosecution treaded more cautiously, wary of underestimating Karoline again. Despite her growing dominance in the courtroom, Karoline remained humble and composed. She didn't gloat over her victories or rub salt in the wounds of her opponents. Instead, she focused on presenting her case with integrity and respect, treating everyone from the judge to the jurors to the opposing counsel with dignity. This approach earned her even more admiration from those watching, including some of the very people who had initially doubted her. By the end of the day, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. What had started as a routine trial had transformed into something extraordinary, a showcase of legal expertise and moral conviction that left a lasting impression on everyone present. Lawyers whispered about how rare it was to encounter someone with such mastery of the law, while ordinary citizens marveled at how a single individual could hold their own against a team of seasoned professionals. For Judge Grayson, the experience was humbling. He had entered the courtroom that morning expecting to oversee a straightforward case, but now he found himself grappling with a deeper sense of unease. Who was this woman who seemed to know the law better than anyone else in the room? Why had she chosen to represent herself instead of hiring a high-profile attorney? And most importantly, what did her presence mean for the future of this trial, and perhaps for him personally? As the session drew to a close, Judge Grayson announced a recess until the following morning. As the crowd filed out of the courtroom, conversations buzzed with excitement and speculation. No one could stop talking about Karoline Leavitt, the unassuming young woman with the gold cross who had proven herself to be a legal genius. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain: this trial was far from over, and Karoline was just getting started. During the recess, Judge Harold Grayson retreated to his chambers, his mind racing with questions. Something about Karoline Leavitt gnawed at him: her quiet confidence, her encyclopedic knowledge of the law, and the way she carried herself with such poise despite the challenges thrown her way. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had underestimated her, and it troubled him more than he cared to admit. Sitting behind his desk, he pulled out the case file on Karoline and began flipping through it, searching for answers. What he discovered left him stunned. According to the documents, Karoline wasn't just some ordinary defendant, she was a legal prodigy. After graduating at the top of her class from Harvard Law School, where she earned accolades for her academic achievements, she had gone on to clerk for 2 highly respected federal judges. Her name had appeared in several prestigious legal journals, cited for her groundbreaking work on constitutional law and civil rights. Yet instead of pursuing a lucrative career at a top-tier law firm, Karoline had chosen a different path, one that baffled many in the legal community. She dedicated herself to advocating for marginalized communities, often taking on cases pro bono and working tirelessly to ensure that justice was accessible to everyone, regardless of their means. Judge Grayson leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of this information sink in. Here was someone who could have had anything: a corner office, a six-figure salary, a life of comfort, but she had given it all up to fight for others. The contrast between her humility and the arrogance he had displayed earlier in the courtroom hit him like a punch to the gut. He thought about how quickly he had judged her, dismissing her as just another defiant defendant when, in reality, she was one of the most accomplished legal minds he had ever encountered. As the recess neared its end, Judge Grayson found himself wrestling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he felt a deep sense of guilt for finding her over something as trivial as wearing a cross. On the other, he recognized that his authority as a judge depended on maintaining order and impartiality. Could he admit his mistake without undermining his position? And if he did, how would Karoline respond? Would she see his apology as sincere, or would she view it as too little, too late? When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was noticeably tense. Spectators returned to their seats, eager to see what would happen next. Judge Grayson took his place at the bench, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he simply looked at Karoline, who sat patiently at the defendant's table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady, but tinged with an uncharacteristic softness. "Ms. Leavitt," he began, "before we proceed, I'd like to ask you a question. Why are you representing yourself in this matter? Surely, with your background and credentials, you could have secured representation from some of the finest attorneys in the country." The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at Karoline. She didn't hesitate before answering, her voice calm and measured. "Your Honor," she said, "I believe that justice should be within reach for everyone, not just those who can afford expensive lawyers. By representing myself, I hope to demonstrate that even someone without vast resources can stand up for their rights and navigate the legal system effectively." Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply with those present. For many in the gallery, especially those who had faced barriers to accessing legal help, her statement struck a chord. It wasn't just about winning her case. It was about proving a larger point, that fairness and equality weren't privileges reserved for the wealthy or powerful, but principles that belong to everyone. Judge Grayson nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you for your candor, Ms. Leavitt," he said. "Your commitment to these ideals is commendable." There was a pause, and then he added, almost reluctantly, "I must confess, I may have misjudged you earlier today. I allowed my own biases to cloud my perspective, and for that I apologize." The admission sent a ripple through the courtroom. Gasps of surprise echoed softly among the spectators, while some exchanged wide-eyed glances. Rarely, if ever, had anyone seen Judge Grayson apologize in open court. Known for his stern demeanor and unwavering adherence to rules, he was not a man who admitted mistakes lightly. Yet here he was, acknowledging his error in front of everyone. Karoline didn't react with triumph or smugness. Instead, she offered a small, respectful nod. "Thank you, Your Honor," she replied. "We all make mistakes, and what matters most is how we learn from them. I appreciate your willingness to reflect on this situation." Her response disarmed the tension in the room, replacing it with a sense of mutual respect. Even Judge Grayson seemed momentarily taken aback by her grace. He cleared his throat and continued, his tone firmer now. "Let us move forward with the proceedings. I trust that both sides will approach the remainder of this trial with the same level of professionalism and integrity that Ms. Leavitt has demonstrated thus far." As the trial resumed, the dynamic in the courtroom had shifted. The hostility that had marked the earlier exchanges between Karoline and the prosecution softened, replaced by a focus on facts and arguments rather than personal attacks. The prosecutor, perhaps sensing that he was dealing with someone far more formidable than anticipated, adopted a more cautious approach. Meanwhile, Karoline continued to build her case with precision and clarity, each argument bolstered by meticulous research and sound reasoning. For Judge Grayson, the experience was transformative. Watching Karoline navigate the complexities of the law with such skill and humility forced him to confront his own assumptions, not just about her, but about the role of empathy and understanding in the pursuit of justice. He realized that being a good judge wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about recognizing the humanity of those who came before him and ensuring that the system served them fairly. By the time the session ended for the day, the courtroom buzzed with renewed energy. People lingered in the hallways outside, discussing what they had witnessed. Some praised Karoline for her intelligence and composure, while others expressed admiration for Judge Grayson's rare display of accountability. Regardless of their opinions, one thing was clear. The events of the day had left an indelible mark on everyone involved. As Karoline gathered her belongings and prepared to leave, a young woman approached her hesitantly. "Excuse me, Ms. Leavitt," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I just wanted to say thank you. Watching you today gave me hope that maybe I can stand up for myself too, even when things seem impossible." Karoline smiled warmly, placing a reassuring hand on the woman's shoulder. "You absolutely can," she said. "Justice belongs to all of us. All it takes is courage and belief in yourself." With that, she walked away, leaving behind a trail of inspiration and a promise that this trial was about much more than the whole outcome. It was about changing hearts and minds one step at a time. The morning of closing arguments arrived, and the courtroom was packed to capacity. Word had spread about the extraordinary events of the previous days, drawing not only reporters and curious onlookers, but also seasoned attorneys eager to witness firsthand the unfolding drama. The air buzzed with anticipation as people whispered among themselves, speculating about how Karoline Leavitt would wrap up her defense. Judge Grayson entered the room, his usual stern expression softened slightly by the weight of what he had learned about Karoline, and perhaps about himself. When it was finally time for closing statements, the prosecutor rose first. He delivered a polished speech, summarizing the prosecution's case with practiced confidence. His voice boomed through the courtroom as he emphasized key points, attempting to sway the jury with emotional appeals and dramatic gestures. But despite his best efforts, there was a palpable shift in the room. The jury members listened politely, but their expressions betrayed a lack of conviction. It was clear that the prosecution's arguments no longer carried the same authority. They once did, not after Karoline had systematically dismantled them piece by piece over the course of the trial. Then it was Karoline's turn. She stood slowly, smoothing her blouse before turning to face the jury. For a moment, she simply looked at them, her gaze steady yet warm. There was no arrogance in her posture, no hint of triumph, just an earnest desire to connect. When she began speaking, her voice was soft but commanding, each word chosen with care. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she started, "this trial has been about more than just the charges brought against me. It has been about fairness, respect, and the principles upon which our justice system is built. At its core, this case asks us to consider whether we value these principles, or whether we allow biases and assumptions to cloud our judgment." Paused, letting her words sink in. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint rustle of papers being shifted on the tables. Then she continued, weaving together threads of logic, morality, and personal experience into a narrative that captivated everyone present. "I want to take a moment to address something that happened at the beginning of this trial, the issue of my cross." She reached into her purse and held up the delicate gold pendant, holding it gently between her fingers. "This cross is not just a piece of jewelry. It represents my faith, my values, and my identity. When I was asked to remove it, I complied because I respect this court and its rules. But I also believe that asking someone to set aside a part of who they are sends a dangerous message, that certain beliefs or identities are less worthy of recognition than others." Her tone remained calm, but there was an undeniable power in her words. "Your Honor fined me $200 for wearing this cross, accusing me of violating courtroom decorum. Yet isn't it ironic that in a nation founded on freedom, including the freedom to practice one's religion, we find ourselves debating whether a symbol of faith has any place in a court of law? This fine wasn't just about me, it was about the kind of society we choose to create. Do we embrace diversity and inclusion, Or do we silence those whose beliefs differ from our own? The jury members exchanged glances, some nodding subtly, as if they understood exactly what she meant. Even Judge Grayson, seated high above the proceedings, seemed transfixed. His pen hovered over his notepad, forgotten for the moment as he listened intently. Karoline transitioned seamlessly into the legal aspects of the case, tying her personal story back to the broader issues at hand. Throughout this trial, you've heard arguments based on evidence, statutes, and precedent. You've seen attempts to discredit testimony and challenge interpretations of the law, and while all of these elements are important, they mean nothing if we lose sight of the bigger picture, the pursuit of truth and justice. She walked slowly toward the jury box, her movements deliberate but natural. Justice isn't blind because it refuses to see. It's blind because it looks beyond appearances. It doesn't matter what I wear, where I come from, or how much money I have. What matters is whether I am treated fairly, judged on the merits of my actions rather than preconceived notions. That is what true justice demands. Her final remarks were delivered with a quiet intensity that left no doubt about her sincerity. I stand before you today not as a lawyer or a defendant, but as a person who believes deeply in the power of fairness. If you decide in my favor, it won't just be a victory for me, it will be a victory for everyone who believes that justice should be accessible, impartial, and compassionate. Thank you for your time, your attention, and most importantly, your integrity. As she returned to her seat, the courtroom erupted into spontaneous applause, a rare occurrence in such a formal setting. Spectators clapped fervently, some even rising to their feet. Judge Grayson quickly called for order, rapping his gavel sharply, but the sentiment in the room was unmistakable. Karoline had struck a chord, not just with the jury, but with everyone who had witnessed her closing argument. For Judge Grayson, the impact was profound. As he prepared to deliver his instructions to the jury, he found himself reflecting on everything that had transpired. He thought about the initial fine he had levied against Karoline, now recognizing it as a mistake, born out of haste and bias. He thought about her unwavering composure and the way she had turned the entire trial into a lesson, not just for him, but for everyone involved. Before dismissing the jury to deliberate, Judge Grayson addressed the court one last time. "Members of the jury," he said, his voice unusually subdued, "you have heard compelling arguments from both sides. Your task is to weigh the evidence carefully and render a verdict based solely on the facts presented. Remember, the law exists to serve justice, not the other way around. I trust that you will approach this responsibility with the seriousness it deserves." With that, the jury was sent off to deliberate. The wait felt interminably long, though. In reality, it lasted only a few hours. During that time, Judge Grayson retreated to his chambers, lost in thought. He reviewed notes from the trial, replaying moments in his mind and grappling with the lessons he had learned. He realized that Karoline's presence in his courtroom had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths, not just about his own prejudices, but about the flaws inherent in the legal system itself. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, drawn by the growing legend of Karoline Leavitt. Reporters jockeyed for position, eager to capture footage of her reaction when the verdict was announced. Lawyers whispered among themselves, marveling at her performance and speculating about what might happen next. Ordinary citizens, inspired by her courage and conviction, shared stories of their own struggles with injustice, hoping that her example might spark change. Finally, the jury returned, their faces unreadable as they filed back into the courtroom. Judge Grayson called the session back to order, his voice steady but tinged with anticipation. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked. The four persons stood, clutching the slip of paper tightly. "We have, Your Honor." A hush fell over the room as everyone leaned forward, waiting for the decision. The foreperson cleared his throat and read aloud. "On the charge of insert charge here, we find the defendant, Karoline Leavitt, not guilty." The announcement sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Cheers erupted, quickly silenced by Judge Grayson's firm rap of the gavel. But the joy in the room was palpable, unrestrained smiles breaking out across faces young and old. Karoline herself remained composed, offering only a small grateful nod as the verdict sank in. Judge Grayson took a deep breath before delivering his final remarks. "In light of the jury's decision," he said, his voice heavy with meaning, "I must also acknowledge my earlier error in fining Ms. Leavitt for wearing a religious symbol. That ruling was unjust, and I hereby overturn it. Ms. Leavitt, I offer my sincerest apology for allowing my biases to interfere with the administration of justice." The apology hung in the air, met with stunned silence followed by murmurs of approval. Karoline rose to her feet, bowing her head slightly in acknowledgement. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said simply. "Your willingness to reflect and grow demonstrates the strength of character we should all strive for." As the gavel fell for the final time, signaling the end of the trial, the courtroom erupted once again, this time in sustained applause. Karoline Leavitt had not only won her case but had also sparked a transformation in the very heart of the legal system. Her journey was far from over, but one thing was certain: she had already changed lives, including her own, in ways no one could have predicted. The days following the trial were unlike anything Karoline Leavitt had ever experienced. What started as a quiet legal battle in a small courtroom quickly escalated into a national conversation about justice, faith, and fairness. Reporters camped outside her modest apartment building, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman who had turned a routine case into a landmark moment. Social media buzzed with hashtags like "Your Justice for Karoline" and "Your Faith in Law," as people shared stories of how her courage inspired them to stand up for their own beliefs. Yet, despite the whirlwind of attention, Karoline remained grounded, choosing to focus on the bigger picture rather than the spotlight. Judge Harold Grayson, too, was undergoing a transformation. His apology in open court had been met with mixed reactions. Some praised him for his humility, while others questioned whether it was enough to undo years of rigid rulings. For Judge Grayson, however, the experience had awakened something within him. He realized that being a judge wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about understanding the human stories behind those laws. Over the next few weeks, he began making changes, not just in his courtroom, but in his approach to justice itself. One of the first things Judge Grayson did was implement mandatory implicit bias training for all judges in his jurisdiction. Drawing from his own experience with Karoline, he emphasized the importance of recognizing and addressing personal prejudices that could influence decisions. During one training session, he recounted the story of the trial, admitting openly that he had let his assumptions cloud his judgment. "We're here to serve justice," he told the room of fellow jurists, "not to impose our own views on others. If we can't see past our biases, then we've already failed." His efforts didn't stop there. Judge Grayson also pushed for reforms aimed at increasing access to legal resources for underrepresented communities. Inspired by Karoline's dedication to advocacy, he worked with local bar associations to create pro bono programs that connected struggling individuals with volunteer attorneys. These initiatives were designed to ensure that no one would have to face the legal system alone, a principle Karoline had embodied throughout the trial. Meanwhile, Karoline returned to her life of quiet advocacy, though she found it harder than ever to stay out of the public eye. Invitations poured in from universities, law firms, and nonprofit organizations, all eager to hear her speak about her experiences. While she declined most offers, she accepted a few invitations to share her story at events focused on empowering marginalized voices. Each time she spoke, her message was consistent. Justice isn't about winning or losing. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it feels impossible. At one such event, held at a community center in a low-income neighborhood, Karoline addressed a packed auditorium filled with people whose lives had been shaped by systemic inequality. She talked about the cross she wore and why it mattered so much to her, not just as a symbol of faith, but as a reminder that everyone deserves to be seen and heard. "When someone tells you that your identity doesn't belong in a certain space," she said, "they're not just attacking what you wear or believe. They're attacking who you are. Don't let anyone take that away from you." Her words resonated deeply with the audience. many of whom approached her afterward to express their gratitude. One elderly woman, clutching a tattered Bible, tearfully thanked Karoline for giving her hope. Another young man, wearing a hijab and crescent pendant around his neck, told her how her trial had inspired him to pursue a career in law. "You showed me that I don't have to hide who I am to succeed," he said. "That means everything." As news of these interactions spread, Karoline's influence grew beyond the courtroom. Her story became a rallying cry for movements advocating religious freedom, equal access to justice, and the dismantling of systemic barriers. Law students wrote papers analyzing her arguments during the trial, citing her as an example of how empathy and intellect could coexist in the practice of law. Civil rights groups used her case to highlight the need for greater protections against discrimination based on personal beliefs. But perhaps the most unexpected outcome of the trial was the bond that formed between Karoline and Judge Grayson. Though they came from vastly different backgrounds and initially clashed over ideology, they discovered a shared commitment to improving the legal system. After the trial, Judge Grayson reached out to Karoline, inviting her to join a newly formed advisory board tasked with reviewing court policies and procedures. To his surprise and relief, she agreed. Their collaboration proved fruitful almost immediately. Together, they drafted guidelines aimed at preventing similar conflicts in the future, emphasizing the importance of respecting individual freedoms without compromising courtroom decorum. They also advocated for increased transparency in judicial decisions, urging courts to provide clearer explanations for rulings that might otherwise seem arbitrary or unfair. Through their partnership, they demonstrated that meaningful change often requires bridging divides and finding common ground. The ripple effects of Karoline's trial extended far beyond the legal world. In schools, teachers incorporated her story into lessons about civics and ethics, encouraging students to think critically about the role of justice in society. In churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples, leaders referenced her unwavering faith as an example of how to live authentically. In the face of adversity, even politicians began citing her case in debates about religious liberty and civil rights, using it as evidence of the need for balanced policies that respected diverse perspectives. Despite the widespread recognition, Karoline never sought fame or accolades. She continued to live simply, devoting her time to helping those in need. Whether it was assisting a single mother navigate custody battles or representing a tenant fighting eviction, she approached every case with the same level of dedication and compassion. For her, the true measure of success wasn't headlines or awards. It was knowing that she had made a difference in someone's life. Judge Grayson, too, found renewed purpose in his work. Where once he had ruled with an iron fist, he now listened more closely, asking questions instead of jumping to conclusions. He encouraged other judges to do the same, reminding them that every person who entered their courtroom carried a story worth hearing. His transformation earned him newfound respect, not only from colleagues but also from the very people he served. By the end of the year, the impact of Karoline's trial was undeniable. It had sparked conversations, inspired action, and challenged long-held assumptions about power, privilege, and justice. People from all walks of life looked to her as proof that one person could make a difference, even in the face of overwhelming odds. And while she never claimed to be extraordinary, her actions spoke volumes, proving that sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest truths. As winter settled over the city, Karoline stood on the steps of the courthouse where her journey had begun. The gold cross still hung around her neck, gleaming softly in the pale sunlight. She thought back to the day she had walked into the courtroom, unaware of the storm she was about to weather. So much had changed since then, not just for her, but for countless others who had found strength in her example. With a contented smile, she turned and walked away, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that the fight for justice was far from over, but neither was she. Months turned into years, and the story of Karoline Leavitt became a cornerstone in discussions about justice, faith, and fairness. What had started as a single courtroom trial evolved into a movement that touched countless lives, reshaping how people viewed the legal system and their place within it. The legacy of that day wasn't confined to the walls of the courthouse. It spread across communities, classrooms, and even legislative halls, leaving an indelible mark on society. Karoline continued her work quietly, steadfastly refusing to let fame or recognition distract her from her mission. She returned to the same modest office where she had worked before the trial, representing clients who couldn't afford high-priced attorneys. Her caseload included everything from housing disputes to employment discrimination cases, each one handled with the same meticulous care and compassion that had defined her courtroom performance. For Karoline, every case was an opportunity to remind people that justice wasn't reserved for the wealthy or powerful. It belonged to everyone. Her presence in the community inspired others to step forward and demand accountability. Local activists cited her example when organizing campaigns for policy changes, while educators used her story to teach students about resilience and integrity. Even businesses began adopting principles of fairness and inclusion, motivated by the public discourse sparked by her trial. Slowly but surely, Karoline's quiet determination created ripples that transformed entire systems. Judge Harold Grayson also underwent a profound evolution, both personally and professionally. His decision to implement implicit bias training and advocate for systemic reforms earned him praise from unlikely quarters. Lawyers who once dreaded appearing before him now spoke of his fairness and willingness to listen. Colleagues admired his courage in admitting past mistakes and using them as catalysts for growth. He became a mentor to younger judges, sharing insights not just about the law but about empathy and humility. The advisory board he co-founded with Karoline flourished, becoming a model for courts nationwide. Together, they introduced policies aimed at making the legal process more transparent and accessible. One groundbreaking initiative allowed defendants to present personal statements during pretrial hearings, giving voice to individuals who might otherwise feel silenced by the system. Another program provided free legal clinics in underserved neighborhoods, ensuring that no one had to face legal challenges alone. These efforts didn't just improve outcomes, they restored trust in institutions that had long been seen as inaccessible or unjust. For Karoline, the partnership with Judge Grayson was unexpected but deeply rewarding. Their collaboration proved that even those with differing perspectives could find common ground when guided by shared values. They often joked that their initial clash over the cross had been the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Behind the Midri, humor lay a deeper truth. Genuine change required bridging divides and embracing uncomfortable conversations. As the years passed, Karoline's story found its way into textbooks, documentaries, and even a feature film. Law schools included her arguments in their curriculum, highlighting how she had combined legal expertise with moral conviction to achieve victory. Students studied her methods, marveling at her ability to remain calm under pressure and her knack for turning adversity into opportunity. Professors emphasized that her success wasn't due to charisma or luck. It stemmed from preparation, perseverance, and an unshakable belief in doing what was right. Outside academia, Karoline's influence reached everyday citizens grappling with injustice. A young mother fighting for custody of her children drew strength from hearing about how Karoline had stood firm against overwhelming odds. A factory worker challenging wrongful termination felt empowered knowing that someone like him had triumphed in court without relying on wealth or connections. Countless others credited her story with helping them find the courage to speak up when faced with discrimination or inequality. Even religious communities embraced her message, seeing in her actions a reflection of their own struggles to balance faith with modern life. Churches organized sermons around themes of perseverance and authenticity, while interfaith groups highlighted her case as an example of unity amid diversity. People of all beliefs recognized that her fight wasn't just about wearing a cross. It was about affirming the dignity of every individual, regardless of creed or background. Despite the accolades and attention, Karoline remained humble, always deflecting praise onto those she served. When asked about her role in sparking such widespread change, she would simply smile and say, "I'm just one person trying to make a difference. The real heroes are the ones who keep pushing forward, even when the odds seem impossible." Her words resonated because they were true. She had never sought to be extraordinary. Yet her ordinary acts of kindness and courage had ignited something extraordinary. Judge Grayson, too, reflected on the journey, acknowledging that Karoline had taught him lessons he carried with him every day. In interviews and speeches, he spoke openly about his initial misjudgment and how confronting his biases had made him a better judge and a better human being. "Justice isn't blind," he often said. "It sees everything, the good, the bad, and the complicated. Our job is to look beyond ourselves and ensure that everyone gets a fair chance." By the time a decade had passed since the trial, Karoline's impact was undeniable. Courts across the country adopted reforms inspired by her case, and grassroots movements grew stronger thanks to her example. Yet perhaps the most remarkable outcome was the shift in mindset. People began to see justice not as something distant or abstract, but as a living, breathing ideal worth striving for. And at the heart of that ideal stood Karoline, a woman whose quiet faith and unwavering resolve reminded everyone that fairness mattered more than power, and compassion mattered more than control. On the 10th anniversary of the trial, a ceremony was held at the courthouse where it all began. Friends, colleagues, and strangers gathered to honor Karoline and Judge Grayson for their contributions to justice. As they unveiled a plaque commemorating the case, Karoline stepped forward to address the crowd. Her voice was soft but steady, carrying the same warmth and sincerity that had captivated audiences years earlier. "This plaque isn't for me," she said, gesturing to the engraved words. "It's for every person who has ever felt unseen or unheard. It's for every child who dreams of a world where fairness prevails. And it's for every judge, lawyer, and citizen who believes we can do better, for ourselves, for our neighbors, and for future generations." Applause erupted, echoing through the halls of the courthouse. But as the cheers subsided, Karoline slipped away quietly, disappearing into the crowd. She didn't need fanfare or monuments. Her legacy was already written in the lives she had touched and the changes she had inspired. For her, the true reward lay in knowing that the fight for justice would continue, carried forward by those who believed in its power to transform the world. And so, the story of Karoline Leavitt came full circle, not with fireworks or grand gestures, but with the quiet assurance that fairness and faith could coexist, and that even the smallest act of courage could spark a revolution.